very much, Mr. Chope, and good afternoon to you. Mr. Chope, I want to use this short time that we have available this afternoon to bring to the Minister's attention the implication of the government's plans, because they are the government's plans, to close 3 post offices in my constituency at Old Sodbury, at Station Road Yate and at Tytherington. In starting this debate off, Mr. Chope, I'm tempted to sympathise with the Minister, because I'm aware that he's dealt with similar debates on post office closures in Cheshire, in Clapham, in Highlands and Islands, in Mole Valley, in Lancashire, in Adur and Worthing, and no doubt others that I have missed. So the human side of me sympathises with him at having to listen to yet another honourable member talk about their local post offices. But actually, Mr. Chope, I don't sympathise, because the government is doing damage to our communities. And I think that the Minister needs to hear this said over and over again until the government does something. So I don't apologise for bringing the debate this afternoon. Because of the series of debates that we've had, Mr. Chope, I asked my office to have a look at what the Minister will say in reply. And I have a note that says in his speech he makes the following 8 points. And he starts by saying that he doesn't play a role in decisions about individual post offices, which I understand. He outlines the change in lifestyle the post office is facing. This includes direct payment of benefits into bank accounts. As a result, 4 million fewer people go through the doors than 2 years ago, and so on. Now, I won't spoil his fun. I'll let him do the other 6. But I did want to comment on that point, because it's something that Post Office Limited said at one of the public meetings in my constituency. They said, well, you know, it's all changed now. People don't use post offices so much. They all have their pensions paid into a bank. And the government says this as though this is some sort of neutral process that's just osmosis, it's just kind of happened, and that's why post offices have got to close. Well, I used to shadow the Department of Work and Pensions, Mr. Chope, and the government drove through that policy with a sledgehammer. They bullied people, they cajoled people, they wrote to them, and they, as near as damn it, forced them to give up their pension books. And while some went for post office card accounts, which means they still go through the door of the post office, many simply gave up the fuss, not least because post office card accounts are very hard to obtain, and they went to the bank. And then another government department comes along and says, oh gosh, there are fewer post office customers, we'd better shut some. And it really is ludicrous for the government to suggest that somehow their hands are clean in this entire process. It's just social change in it, gov. Well, I'm afraid it isn't. It's deliberate government policy. Yes, over decades these trends are happening. But actually, post offices and sub-post offices, if they'd had the time, could have done far more to adjust to the new patterns of business, to developing the new sorts of business that the Minister in his reply will no doubt talk about. But it's the speed of change that's caught so many of them on the hop. Government forcing through the loss of one of their major pieces of business. This is government responsibility. It's not social trends. Now, I've got that off my chest. So what about my constituency and the 3 post offices? And I just want to give a very thumbnail sketch of the impact of each of these closures on them. And then I want to ask the Minister some specific questions about rescue packages and about the financial arrangements and about the closure process and the appeal process and so on, that I'd like to get some response on. Old Sodbury is a small village shop with a village post office. It's the only shop in the village. Neighbouring hamlets use it as well. And one of the interesting aspects of the comments I've had back is that an option to save money would have been shorter hours. And I think actually the sub-postmistress would have been quite amenable to shorter hours, and the post office would have saved some money and the balance sheet would have looked a bit better. But of course the government's target isn't a budgetary one, it's 2,500 closures. So Post Office Limited doesn't get a tick in its box for fewer hours at Old Sodbury. It only gets a tick in its box if it shuts it. Now, given that, as long as people know when the post office is open, they can to some extent juggle when they go there, then actually having shorter hours would surely have been less disruptive to people, would still have saved some money, than simply shutting it altogether. And I do wonder whether the target mechanism has created some perverse outcomes whereby money could have been saved, the public could still have had a service, and that might have been a better outcome for all concerned. The second in my constituency is in a Tesco store, a Tesco Express store in Station Road Yate, and it's in a part of the main town in my constituency that's a less well-off area, fewer cars. And on a map, it's not far from the Crown Office in the middle of the town, and on a map it looks fine. But actually to the elderly residents of the sheltered bungalows who came along to the public meeting that we had, they're not going to get a bus because there's no direct bus, they're not going to drive, and they simply can't walk that far. And when they do get to, when those of them who can do get to the Crown Office, they have to queue and queue and queue and queue. And everybody says, at the moment, the Crown Office can't cope. And people report going into the Crown Office and they come back again an hour later, an hour later, an hour later to find a time when they don't have to queue because there's nowhere to sit down. Now, these aren't insurmountable problems, but nobody believes they're going to be resolved. Nobody believes that because this is a cost-cutting measure, the Post Office will then spend money on the receiving branch and provide extra counters, chairs for people to sit down, or anything like that. So these people are just going to be disenfranchised, effectively. And I have particularly harsh words for Tesco. First, because the staff in the Tesco store at Yate found out about the Post Office closure through reading about it in the newspaper. How shoddy is that? And I spoke to Tesco's government relations people, so-called, and said, well, if we can try to put together some sort of rescue package or try and help some way, get the community together, would you play your part? You know, perhaps let the Post Office go on operating in your premises or something. They were staggeringly reluctant. They're just not interested. Now, the Minister might say, well, they're not a charity, why should they? But then all of us as members of Parliament get letters all the time from Tesco telling us how community-minded they are, asking us to present computers to school kids. Well, I've refused for years now to present Tesco computers to school kids because they do not give a damn about the local community. Because when it comes to the crunch, when it comes to something that really matters, they're not interested. And that's been my experience with the Tesco Express in Yate. But the third post office that I want to bring the Minister's attention to in particular, and the one where we are perhaps making some headway on trying to put a package together, and I'd be grateful for his specific response on this, is in Tytherington. It's a smallish village. The post office in their paperwork said there were 331 people there. Postwatch have done some numbers for me who say that on that, had they measured the number correctly, it would have been over 600 people. So the impact of the closure, the post office has got wrong by a factor of a half, as far as we can see. But it's an area that lost its post office in '96, and the community said this isn't good enough. We need a post office and we need a village shop. So they started one. And residents put their cash where their mouth is. They have shares in the village shop. They run it on a rota. The post office bit gets it rent-free, rates-free, lighting and heating all paid for. And it's a fantastic achievement for a village that was at risk of dying because it lost its post office and it lost its school. And you could have seen that village dying, and the people of Tytherington 10 years ago got off their backsides, made it happen. It's a beautiful shop. And now what's going to happen? They're going to lose the post office. That doesn't guarantee the shop goes, but it blooming well doesn't help. And it's a kick in the teeth. There's no other word for it. They had a village meeting that I helped to organise with the parish council, and the village hall was so packed to overflowing, some people came and went away because they couldn't squeeze in. And the post office people said, come on, we haven't seen this many people. And it's interesting that actually some of the more rural and villagey communities feel most passionately about this. So what can we do about it? Well, on Friday of this week, I've got post office headquarters people coming down to my constituency. They're meeting the parish council from Tytherington and the village shop committee people. And we're going to find out the hard financial information about what it would take to keep this thing going. I have to say to the Minister, getting financial information out of the post office has been blood out of a stone. I think it was only because I have this debate today that I even got any information at all about the financial saving to the post office of closing these shops. I understand the issue of commercial sensitivity, but you can't put a rescue package together unless you know what the numbers are. And the worry is not that we will never get there, but that actually what I'm hearing from Postwatch is this post office, assuming it goes ahead, and most of us assume that they all will have to close before we rescue it. And I hope the Minister would give me a response on that point. The sense is, because our consultation period's over, decisions are due in a few weeks' time, and then closures will start a few weeks after that, we could have the ludicrous situation whereby we've got a live rescue bid, serious, community leaders maybe, I'm not committing them, but maybe putting money in, maybe the local authority playing a part, maybe an outreach service, so we may have struck a deal with a neighbouring postmaster to come in and operate an outreach service. All of this could be going on, and post office could still shut it in the meantime. And it just seems to me, I had thought I had heard ministers or others say, if there was a live rescue attempt, something serious, not just tokenistic, then they'd hold off on a closure. But that's not what I'm being told, so I hope the Minister can clarify that point for me. And I'd like to know what pressure the Minister can put on Post Office Limited in terms of the attitude that they adopt to these rescue packages and these sorts of proposals. My sense excuse me, is that the Post Office were caught on the hop by the idea of anyone putting a rescue package together. When Essex County Council came up with their idea, it seems like everyone ran around like headless chickens. Oh, we hadn't thought of that. People might try and save these things. People might try and put some money in from other sources. They might be creative. Can the Minister assure us that he is now banging heads together at the Post Office saying, be as creative as you possibly can, within the framework that we've given you? Actually, if you can do things, work with communities, give them financial information, give them a bit of breathing space, be creative, be imaginative, then do it. And I hope that's the Minister's line to the Post Office. Because I sense, I wouldn't want to exchange jobs with the people trying to do this in the Post Office for all the tea in China. I mean, it must be a miserable job. But the people you speak to, you get the feeling they just hate doing what they're doing because they came into the Post Office to run a network, not to kill a network. And yet, they've been given a target of closures. And so, do they really want to invest a lot of time and energy helping us put together a package that will make things work, when actually that's not part of, they don't get rewarded for that? So can the Minister assure us that they will actually get some sort of return for that kind of, some thanks for that sort of activity? So, Mr. Chope, what I'm saying is, all of us would like to save all of the post offices in our patch. Of the three in my constituency, the one where the community has perhaps rallied in largest numbers and has shown the most initiative historically, certainly, and where there aren't issues with a multinational like Tesco's, who frankly are the biggest problem we've got with regard to one of them, some sort of community initiative must be possible. But I hope the Minister can assure us that the financial terms of any such initiative will be as sympathetic as possible. Now, it's a funny word to use, but in other words, I understand that there are common costs wherever the Post Office runs branches. I understand that there are central costs that are allocated locally and that, a Post Office isn't just the marginal cost, as it were. But if we can get a package together locally, how can we be confident that the Post Office won't then say, well, to keep something going here, we will charge you X, we will charge you a figure, we'll charge you this for central computing services or banking services or whatever it is they have to buy in. How can we be confident that that's a minimum figure, as low as they can possibly keep it? Or how far is there a risk that the Post Office will say, hang on, A, we don't really want to save this anyway, frankly, it's no skin off our nose if it shuts, but B, we can get some cash in here, we can help ourselves, so we'll bump it up a bit and they'll never know that it only costs us X to run this branch and we'll charge them Y. How confident are we going to be that the terms of any arrangement are going to be fair? I wonder if the Minister can respond to that. And finally, I wonder if the Minister could just say a little bit more about the whole concept of outreach services. Because, in a sense, I'm slightly conflating two different things here. I mean, one is, first and foremost, we'd like them to say, all right, it's a fair cop, Tytherington would be a disaster to shut, we won't shut it, that'd be great. If they don't say that, I'm not clear what the appeal process is. My sense is there's virtually no meaningful appeal process. I mean, I've been talking to Postwatch, and I'm not quite clear whether actually Postwatch can ask Adam Crozier or his mates to look at it again, but my sense is that there's no meaningful appeal process that's likely to change anything. But originally there was talk of 500 outreach services, I think, across the network. But the word on the street, as it were, is that perhaps this might be a slightly more widely used model that might help to ensure postal services across a broader range of areas at a lower cost than having a full-blown sub-post office. And I just wonder if the Minister can clarify both his government's and the Post Office Limited's philosophical approach to outreach services. Is this something that the government wants to encourage, for example? So could I expect the Post Office to actively say, well, actually, outreach is good for us because we cover a whole population, but it's fairly cheap, and therefore am I knocking at an open door? Or are they going to say, no, we're only allowed 500 outreach across Britain, so Bristol and Somerset's going to get 21, and you can't have one of the 21 because we know which one's already. How does this is that a rigid number, or is there flexibility where if that sort of service model seems right for a particular community, that's what we can have? Mr. Chope, I could have stood and read out the heartbreaking letters, emails, petitions, and all the rest of it that we've received from local residents. The Minister has heard the like before many times. But I can only stress to him that with a community and a constituency like mine, you've got the whole gamut. You've got relatively hard-pressed urban areas who are going to suffer. You've got village communities for whom it is a cliche, but it's true. The post office and village shop is the heart of the community. And in a sense, the most I hope from him today, but also the least I hope from him today, is some constructive encouragement that where we're trying to be creative and innovative locally, as the people of Tytherington have already done once 10 years ago, he will be on their side, at least to this extent.
Thank you, Mr. Chope, and I'd of course like to begin by congratulating the member for North Avon on securing this debate. He's absolutely right. This is a debate, a type of debate I've taken part in many times in recent months. He's also right in his understanding that as a minister I don't decide which post office closes and which stays open. I will do my best in the time available to me to answer his questions around funding, outreach, support and so on. And I understand that he's in dialogue with Post Office Limited about some of these issues. He has, as I understand it at the moment, 28 post offices in his constituency, of which 3 are scheduled for closure. So where does all this come from? It comes from an announcement by the Secretary of State for what was then the DTI in May of last year, that there would be up to 2,500 post office closures out of just over 14,000 branches across the country at the moment, with 500 of the new outreach services that he referred to. And I want to begin by obviously saying that I understand the concern, indeed the very strong protest that has existed in some communities over this decision. It is one thing to announce it in the generality, it's another thing to see it implemented locally in individual post offices in individual communities. He talked about the government's role, and I do want to pause on this. He knows about this because, as he said, he was his party's spokesperson on working pensions for a number of years. And it is true that the government wrote to people about change and so on, but we also gave people a choice, and people do have the post office card account. It's still used by several million people, but we also got to think about how people are used to being paid these days. I don't know if he's going to be going to the post office for his pension every week when he retires, and I wish him a long and healthy and successful retirement whenever it comes. But 9 out of 10 pensioners who come up for retirement today choose not to do that, and they choose to have their pension paid into their bank account, even though they can still use the post office card account if they so choose. And that is illustrative of some of the challenges facing the network. The network loses £500,000 every day that it's open, and these losses have more or less doubled in the last few years. It's lost 4 million customers a week, as well as the 9 out of 10 pensioners new retirees who choose such a direct payment for their pensions. In fact, of the existing number of pensioners, even 8 out of 10 of those choose direct payment. And when he talks about the government's role, I think this is interesting and important, because, for example, if we take online services, the government worked to put together an online service for car tax renewal a couple of years ago. Now, the use of this service has risen almost exponentially. No one is forced to use it. There is still the availability to renew car tax at post offices, but last year it was being used by 500,000 people a month. This year it's around about 1 million people a month, and half of them are using it outside the normal office hours of 9 to 5. Now, what is his position on this? Is his position that when people are used to using the internet in other spheres of their life, either to book flights or pay bills or other services, that somehow the government should say, no, you can't do that? Because if that is his position, and that's his party's position, then I have to say that I disagree with this. I think the government has to respond to changes in other spheres of people's lives and make these kind of services available online. Now, it does have an impact on the post office, as do other changes, such as competition. And it's because there are other networks like PayPoint who can bid for contracts that something like the TV licence is now no longer with the post office. And this has resulted in significant difficulty for the network in terms of losses of custom and financial losses. And these changes do reflect the way that we live. As a country, most of us have taken part in them, and most people, as I say, have either ordered goods over the internet or paid bills over the internet. 70% of the country is now online in one way or another. So what is the government's response to all this? It's not to walk away and to say the post office has to be a purely commercial network. We haven't done that. Of the 14,000 post offices which are currently in the network, it's estimated that only around 4,000 would operate as a purely commercial network. That's not the stance that we've taken at all. We have instead become the first government to put substantial subsidy into the network. And I think this is important because he talked and was critical about the government's role. No previous government has subsidised the post office network. We have, by the time we get to the year 2011, we'll have put up to £3.7 billion into supporting the post office in one way or another. That includes a subsidy of £150 million a year, without which his constituents and constituents throughout the country would be facing thousands more post office closures than is currently the case. So the government's position has been to support the network. But governments also have a duty to the taxpayer, and subsidy cannot be unlimited in the face of some of the changes that I've talked about. It cannot be blind to the impact of the internet or direct debit or the way that people do business and receive money in today's world. And these challenges have actually been recognised not just by the government but by the General Secretary of the Federation of Sub-Postmasters themselves. He said at the start of this programme, although regrettable, and I'm quoting, "We believe that closures are necessary to ensure the remaining post offices are able to thrive in the future." So he recognises the difficulties being faced by the network. The principal opposition spokesman for the Conservative Party said in a debate on the post office network only last month, and again I'm quoting, "We have to face the facts about the future of post office services or postal services in this country. We fully expect the network to shrink in size. We have never given a guarantee that no post offices will close." So I think there's widespread recognition about the challenges facing the network. And I understand fully that no one likes to see their post office close, even those who may not use them very often, but like the idea of having a post office in their community. But it's also important to remember the scale of what's planned, even after completion of this programme in the Bristol and Somerset area, which covers his constituency. Almost 90% of customers will see no change in the post office branch that they use. And in fact, in total, 99% of the area's population will either see no change in the branch that they use or will remain within 1 mile, measured by road, of an alternative post office branch. So this is not whole-scale destruction of the post office network. It is a reduction in the size of the network, but the vast majority of post office users will still be using the same branch they always were, and almost all post office users will either be using the same branch or be within a mile of another branch. Now, he asked me some questions about the consultation and appeals and so on, and I want to help him with that. I think the first thing is to stress what the question in the consultation is, because this isn't, as the Select Committee reported in its recent report a couple of months of this, a referendum on whether or not people want post office closures. That decision was announced by the Secretary of State in May of last year, and there was a letter sent to him and to all MPs just before this process began, which set this out. And I'd like to quote from that. It said that the consultations, and I quote, "would not concern the principle of the need for change of the network, nor its broad extent and distribution. That has already been established by the government in its response issued on the 17th of May. Rather, consultation will be seeking representations in the most effective way in which government policy as set out in that response document can best be implemented in the particular area in question." So it's about the how this is implemented, not about the whether. Now, when it comes to appeals, there is a review mechanism, and it's triggered by Postwatch, who are the consumer voice in this area. He said he was in touch with Postwatch, and that's the right and sensible way if he believes that somehow the Post Office, in terms of the how rather than the whether, have got this wrong in terms of their own criteria. Postwatch can trigger a proposal and put it into review, That can go up through several levels from the local to the national and can ultimately, if necessary, be decided by Alan Layton, who's the chairman of the Royal Mail Group. So there is a review process, but it is triggered by Postwatch. He also asked me about proposals for local funding, rescue packages and so on. The first thing to say about this is that the government, stress again, funds the post office network to a very large extent. That funding includes subsidy. It also includes provision to help improve the situation in the remaining network, because I understand what he says about queuing and the handling of custom elsewhere. And we have had several proposals from local authorities who have said that they are interested. And there's just a few things to spell out about this. The Secretary of State wrote on the 19th of March to the Managing Director of the Post Office and to the Chairman of the Local Government Association about this issue. I believe a copy is available in the library if he wishes to see it, and that will set out the government's position. And broadly speaking, the points made in that letter are that where a local authority is seriously interested, or another third party which may not be a local authority, we would encourage Post Office Limited to talk to them. But this is not an easy process and not a costless process, because the reason that branches are closing are for the reasons that I have set out. And so Post Office Limited will expect to recover their costs for this. And that won't just be the payments to the staff, it will also be those central support costs that he talked about. And those can be expensive in terms of the provision of cash around the country to all the branches, the provision and maintenance of IT, and various other costs. So even with volunteer labour, the running of a post office is a cost to Post Office Limited in most circumstances. In fact, when we take both central costs of the network and the individual payments to individual branches into account, 3 post offices out of 4 run at a cost to Post Office Limited. The other thing that Post Office Limited are keen to secure is a commitment for several years, because we as a government have given the network some financial certainty going forward by guaranteeing the subsidy at least until 2011. So they will also look for some similar certainty from any third party who may wish to fund a post office, because they are keen to avoid the situation of being in the same circumstances in 6 months or a year's time. And in terms of the future, I think it's important to stress that once the network has gone through this process, we will still have a post office network which is bigger than all the banks put together. It will be 3 times larger than the top 5 supermarket chains put together, including the one that he is obviously not a fan of. And we will still have, through the access criteria, a significant network which has got an unparalleled reach in both rural and urban communities throughout the country. I'm happy to give way.
Could the Minister just respond on outreach? What is, are they encouraging it? How does that work?
I'm grateful to him for his reminder. We have set out as part of this that there should be up to 500 outreach projects. Outreach is not costless, because outreach needs a sub-postmaster in a neighbouring town to take over the project. It is innovative. I think it's successful where it's worked. I've visited outreach projects myself. There was an announcement a couple of weeks ago that in addition to the 500 outreach, there would then be new provision geared more at urban areas, because the outreach has been geared more at rural areas, to ensure that this kind of part-time and flexible approach may be available in both urban and rural areas. So there is potential in that, and I would encourage him to talk to Post Office about it. So I do appreciate this is difficult for his constituents, but the government has stood by the Post Office with significant subsidy. It is lifestyle change which is a challenge to the network, and for the future this will be about developing new products and new reasons for people to use the post office, rather than trying to rewind the clock in the face of the lifestyle change that I've talked about.
Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.